Professor Alan Levine. He is the director of the Political Theory Institute, and he is an associate professor of philosophy at AU. So, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And I also want to mention a few future events. On February 16th, we're having another Janus Forum debate featuring Roger Kimball of the New Criterion and AU philosophy professor Farhang Irfani on the role of the arts in liberal democracies. On April 26th, we're having Professor Mark Blitz of Claremont College coming, talking about politics and responsibility. And two other things quickly. The Political Theory Institute is hosting an essay contest with a $500 prize. I want to call it to your attention. It is for the best essay on a topic related to classical liberalism. Any author, theme, topic related to classical liberalism or something in America, you can go to the Political Theory Institute website, and there's all the specs are posted there. The deadline for that is Monday, April 22nd. And one last thing, this summer I'm leading a course in Thailand on the politics of human trafficking. So if anybody is interested in that, you should see me. I think there might be flyers around somewhere outside, but if not, it's in the course catalog, and you can. That'll be meeting in Thailand for 2 weeks in the second half of July. So I would also like to thank some people. I would like to thank the Thomas W. Smith Foundation for supporting the Janus Forum debates here at American University. I'd like to thank the Kennedy Political Union and Chandler for co-sponsoring this event. I'd like to thank my assistant, Carrie Charbonneau, and everyone in the SPA Dean's Office who helped out with logistics, Dan McCabe, Alex Pesmino, Kenko Mori. And I'd like to introduce our speakers now. So we are really privileged to have two people who know the NSA extremely well from different perspectives. General Michael Hayden is a retired 4-star general who served as the director of both the CIA and NSA, among many other illustrious appointments in his nearly 40-year career of public service. He was appointed director of the NSA by President Bill Clinton and served 1999 to 2005. After his tenure at the NSA, General Hayden went on to serve as the country's first principal deputy director of national intelligence, the highest-ranking intelligence officer in the armed forces. In May of 2006, President George W. Bush appointed him director of the CIA, and he served there until 2009. He's a frequent commentator in many major news outlets, as well as having been a foreign policy advisor to Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. He's currently a principal in the Chertoff Group and a distinguished visiting professor at George Mason University. Barton Gellman, immediately to my left, is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and lead reporter on Edward Snowden's NSA disclosures at the Washington Post. He's actually met Snowden several times, right? Several?
In person once.
In person once, okay. Gellman spent 21 years on the staff of the Washington Post, and he's won numerous awards, of which I'll mention only a few. His first Pulitzer was awarded in 2002 for reporting on the September 11th attacks. His second Pulitzer was awarded to him in 2008 for a series on Dick Cheney's vice presidency that went on to become the basis of his best-selling book, Angler, the Cheney Vice Presidency. And that book won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was named a New York Times Best Book of 2008. Today, he's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and lecturer and author in residence at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. And he returned to the Post temporarily in 2013 after receiving various NSA documents from Edward Snowden. And with his colleagues, he's broken stories about many of the things that we're going to be discussing tonight. So I'd like to have you join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers and the national audience with C-SPAN. Welcome to American University. Thank you. Now, the format for this evening's presentation is we're going to have conversation amongst ourselves for the first hour or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from you all. And there are two microphones I see, one in the middle and one on the side over there. And it seems to me that all of the fundamental questions on the NSA and privacy rotate around balancing security and privacy. How have we done it so far? How should we do it? And there's the further question of what privacy even means in a digital age, where every time you go to the store or use your Easy Pass, people are keeping track of you, let alone every time you use an email on most of the accounts. But to make an informed judgment about the NSA programs, we have to know what they are. And so I want to spend a lot of time during our hour talking about what those particular programs are, how they work, etc. But first, since we are hosting this, the Political Theory Institute, I'd like to start by asking a few big normative questions around which I think all the others will revolve. And so what I want to do is I'll ask my first question to each of you now, and so you'll have a few seconds to think while I'm asking the other. And so first, for Bart, what right do you have to publish secrets determined to be such by our duly constituted political authorities? How can you justify supplanting your own judgment for that of the people's government? And for General Hayden, as the parallel question, what right does the NSA or any other governmental body have to keep secrets in the first place? Democracy is based on consent, and if we the people don't know what you're doing, doesn't that necessarily undermine democracy? So, for Bart?
Okay, so I'm going to give an answer that starts with the proposition that my history and politics grades are no longer subject to change. I'll give us a little bit of a theoretical or structural answer to that question, and it has to do with the structure of self-government in a democracy. If the government is working for us, it usually is thought to have two elements, authorization and accountability. We authorize them in elections. We say, you get to be in charge for a while. And then we hold them accountable for their performance, not only for purposes of re-election, but throughout a sort of a constant civil society political conversation in which the people get their say through a variety of mechanisms between elections. And to me, the principal conflict here may not be between security and privacy. That's certainly an important set of questions. But to me, it's between self-government and self-defense, both of which are core values. In fact, they are both, they're both touched on by the time you get through the preamble to our Constitution. Defense is fourth among the 6 principal purposes of the creation of this form of government, and its first words are "we the people." So you have this conflict, which is to say we have secrets that are important to keep inherently for purposes of protecting ourselves, but information is essential to govern ourselves. And the model I have in mind is that nobody gets to maximize one interest or the other. They have to be balanced. And you would like it would be cleaner and neater if you had a theoretical model in which there was some trustworthy, principled balancer who could do that balance for you. But there's not. I am not elected. I am not accountable to the people for decisions I make about what to publish. But it's also the case that for the president and everyone working for him, they're not competent to decide what we need to know in order to hold them accountable. We can't give them that power. And so we know information is power. Secrecy is the power to withhold information, to obscure information, is very great power, especially when it's combined with surveillance, because what it sets up is a sort of a one-way mirror in which we become more and more transparent to our government, and they become more and more opaque to us with the growth of surveillance technology and the growth of the secrecy that surrounds it. And so the somewhat unsatisfactory answer we're left with, and I could go into this at much greater length, once you rule out all the other possibilities, is that there's going to be a process of competition in which governments try to keep secrets, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. I mean, there's nobody who works in the intelligence field, and I'm quite sure that that Mike would agree with this, would not accept that there's a massive overclassification. There's all kinds of things that are stamped habitually or for other reasons with secret stamps that don't need to be. And we can get into examples of that if you'd like. The idea is the government tries to keep secrets and we try to find them out. And no one exerts coercive power at the margin. And I guess I'll just put it this way: there are trade-offs. You could imagine a society. We studied one very closely in the old Soviet Union, which maximized either security or the entrenchment of the state authorities against all other interests. And so when I was a tourist in the Soviet Union in Moscow in 1984, I found I was getting lost all the time, wandering the streets of Moscow, and I usually don't need that much help with that, but it turned out that they deliberately drew the tourist maps incorrectly. Because in case Napoleon came by looking for the Battle of Borodino, you'd take a wrong turn. But I mean, it's not literally irrational to say we're going to publish inaccurate maps, because that could, I mean, all information in principle is useful to the enemy. But that's not the model we have. The model we have is not, for example, with JFK and his big inaugural speech saying, we will pay no price, we will bear no burden to secure the blessings of liberty. There's a balance. We are prepared to accept some risk in order to govern ourselves. And so after the competition, and I'll close here, I find something out, or I get a big pile of documents in a kind of sui generis, 100-year storm of a leak, and I now know secrets that I'm not supposed to know, according to the government. Then there is a more cooperative process in which I then go and talk to people, like the people who, like Mike Hayden when he held that old job, and we discuss the equities. And the Washington Post and every other journalist covering this stuff withholds a great deal of what they know if they're persuaded that the public interest is outweighed, the public interest in the subject is outweighed by the danger of disclosure.
Barton and I agreed on an awful lot of this question. The most important agreement, I think, is that this is a conflict of values. This is not the forces of light versus the forces of darkness. These are things that free peoples have to balance all the time. And frankly, where that line is really dependent upon the totality of the situation in which we find ourselves. That line can move back and forth, depending on realities. When my public affairs officer or someone else would be aware that someone in Bart's profession had a story we felt really problematic, they would come to me as director of either NSA or CIA and lay it out. And I said, all right. And I generally, since they'd already worked with the reporter, I would generally call the editor. And, my secretary would make the call, and generally speaking, the editor would take a call from the director of CIA. Right? And the editor would come on the line, and this is Mike Hayden. I really want to thank you for taking the call. And invariably, I would then begin the conversation with, look, we both have responsibilities for the welfare and safety of this republic. But how you're about to exercise your responsibilities, I believe, is going to make it much harder for me to exercise mine. So we really do need to talk. And we would have that dialogue that Bart suggests. I mean, this is really tricky, all right? He's got to have freedom of the press. I mean, there's a reason that's in the First Amendment, all right? On the other hand, the government has legitimate secrets, okay? No fooling, things are overclassified, and human beings in government will make decisions that perhaps are less noble than we would all want to be. But as Bart also suggests, when Bart or the Post or the Times declassify information on their judgment, they are performing an inherently governmental act without the system of checks and balances and responsibilities that normally go over here on this side of the equation. This is getting much, much more complicated in our society. Bart mentioned the whole question of accountability. And how do you hold a government accountable without a great deal of transparency? Let me walk you through the arc of American history here when it comes to American espionage. I mean, look, there are other secrets. I mean, the American intelligence community isn't the only one that keeps secrets. All right? The Federal Reserve, they keep secrets. Okay? I mean, there are a lot of organs of government where the general welfare is improved by the government being closed and secretive. Right? At the beginning of the Republic, and in most Western democracies, and in fact in many Western democracies still, this espionage thing is pretty much contained in the executive branch. I mean, George Washington was the nation's first spy master. When he became president, after running the spy ring for the Continental Army, when he became president, he insisted on a secret covert action budget. All right? And with very little, if any, congressional oversight. Right? And so espionage has generally been viewed as being a province of the executive. And the way the nation changed espionage policy was change the executive. By the mid-1970s, there was broad agreement after the Church Commission that having this responsibility, this knowledge, this oversight only within the executive branch was insufficient. And the grand compromise of the 1970s was to create two bodies in Congress and a rather unusual court to spread this transparency and accountability over all three branches of government. So we end up with the House Permanent Select Committee and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and we end up with the FISA court. The theory was that that was sufficient transparency to legitimately get consent of the governed in a representative democracy. After all, this isn't ancient Athens. Okay? That consensus that the grand compromise of the 1970s was adequate has eroded. And now, and I'm sure we're going to talk about the 215 program here pretty soon, and,
yes.
and people at NSA are going to say, well, wait a minute. It's been authorized by two presidents, the Congress legislated it, reauthorized it, and it's overseen by the FISA court. That's the Madisonian trifecta. I got it all. I got all three branches of government. And the great swing in American popular culture right now, and I'm just not talking about out here on the wings, all right? I mean sustained among thoughtful people, is that no longer constitutes sufficient consent of the governed. Okay. You told Dianne Feinstein, you told Saxby Chambliss, you told Dutch Ruppersberger, you told Mike Rogers, but you didn't tell me. And we're kind of at that cusp in our political culture. When I was director of CIA, I had an outside advisory board. I had a wonderful team of outside civilians. One of them, I've got her permission to use her name, was Carly Fiorina. I gave Carly and a subcommittee a tough job. Another subcommittee was doing IT, another subcommittee was doing recruiting. I gave Carly a philosophical problem. Carly, take a couple months, study this problem. Come out and tell me, will America be able to conduct espionage in a future inside a broader political culture that every day demands more transparency and more public accountability from every aspect of national life? And they studied it for about 4 months, and they came back and gave me a very firm, heartily speaking, we're not sure, which is a very telling answer. And so here we are, all right? Here we are with a national enterprise that I'm just going to assume we all believe is legitimate and necessary, American espionage, and a broader political culture that demands more transparency of an enterprise that demands secrecy for its very nature, for its very success. And that's why this is now so difficult for all of us.
Okay, so thank you. Following up, so Bart, General Hayden described what you're doing, or the release of this information as being an inherently governmental function. And we'll go into all the various checks that exist on the NSA and whether they work or not. But when you get that information, I guess there's no checks on you or a reporter or or are there? what is the process that you go through in determining, wow, this fell on my lap, should I make it public or not?
All right. Well, are there checks, and what's the process? Some of the same checks on us, not the sort of de jure, but the de facto checks are not so different than they are on the government itself, which is to say that lots of what the government does or doesn't do is not because it doesn't literally have the power, according to some legal interpretation of the words on the page, but because it believes that there would be grave sort of public consequences, that public opinion wouldn't support them, that they would suffer reputational damage or political harm. The Washington Post actually cares quite a bit about its reputation for telling the truth and telling it responsibly. And nobody wants to be responsible for some terrible thing happening. If we publish story X and the next day there are 10 people strung up in the square of some foreign country because we disclosed their identities, that would be a really bad thing for the Washington Post, in addition to being a really bad thing for the country. And so there are checks there. The process is as follows.
Before we go into the process, just on the checks point. So for any of the NSA stories that you've run, are you aware of any bad consequences? And then maybe General Hayden on that point.
So there's a bit of a conundrum here, which is to say that a secret has spilled, and the Washington Post has published something. And suppose you are inside the intelligence community and you know very specifically what some consequence was. Disclosing that knowledge itself discloses a capability, and so they are constrained sometimes from talking about it. On the other hand, there are consequences that we would know about, and it's also the case that James Clapper, the director of national intelligence, told in a closed-door briefing, and he used language quite different from what he usually says in public, that they went back and did a study, and they found that over the years there have been breaches of secrets lots of times, usually in the context of espionage cases, but sometimes in the context of news stories or foreign services disclosing something, or sometimes presidents disclose really sensitive secrets because they want to make they have a good political reason for doing so. For example, when Ronald Reagan played a recording or quoted a recording of a conversation that took place in Libya in order to persuade European allies to allow American planes to fly over their airspace so they could bomb Libya. He wanted to prove that we had the case nailed, and very much against the recommendations of the intelligence community, he revealed that capability. In any case, they do a study. What's the damage assessment? And what Clapper told closed-door meeting was that these damage assessments consistently overestimate damage. It is not unnatural or abnormal for the NSA to gain and lose capabilities. Technology is changing all the time. A channel that is working now to listen in on target X stops working tomorrow because Microsoft changes their network architecture, or the other country chooses a different vendor, or the target gets tired of that phone and switches to a different company, or whatever. There are many, or targets are trying to practice communication security, and so they switch to things. The other thing that Clapper said is that people will change their behavior, but they will make mistakes, and we will exploit them. The NSA is not in immediate danger of losing its global preeminence in signals intelligence. I concede that it's possible that some of the stories published by some of the news organizations sooner or later will have degraded the ability to listen in on something. I am prepared to accept that, and I believe that you should be prepared to accept that, because at the same time we're finding out things that they've been doing that are completely contrary to what the public understanding was of what their job is and how they do it. I mean, if there is a program going on and the executive branch has blessed it, and a select few people in Congress have blessed it, and a closed FISA court has blessed it, and then when it becomes public, the American people are shocked by it, and many, many people are angry about it, and they start telling their members of Congress, and members of Congress start introducing bills to stop it, and it gets brought to federal court, and the first federal judge to assess its constitutionality says that it's Orwellian and very likely unconstitutional, then there's another way to tell the story of whether we had already consented as a society to this happening. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. General Hayden, are you aware of any, I know you're not in government now, but are you aware of specific negative consequences from any of the NSA stories being
Yeah, I see
published?
3 tiers of consequences, all of them damaging. No, I'm not in government, so I don't know. All right.
Do you maintain a clearance? Are you being briefed on that?
No, so that I can speak freely at events like this, I don't go to get updated. All right? So I don't have to compartmentalize.
If I would have known this was outdated information, I would have chosen someone else.
No, I know how to read a newspaper. Okay. There are 3 tiers of damage. One's operational. All right. And by the way, if I were in government, let me rephrase the question you just asked me. Would you give me a list of all the communications you didn't intercept yesterday? I mean, that's really the question you want me to give you the answer to. And, well, I don't know. All right. There is an erosion, and I agree with Bart that this SIGINT game, signals intelligence, it's constantly moving. All advantage in SIGINT is transient. All right. You've got a penetration. You're right. You just download the next dot whatever. You don't have a penetration anymore. Somebody buys the next level of encryption. You don't have that frequency anymore. Communications paths change patterns, not running away from you, just because people who build communication paths have a smarter way to spend a buck, and you've got to go after it. So all advantage is transient. Okay? We have simply accelerated the rate at which we will lose our current accesses. Right? And that to my mind, is just unarguable. So that's one level. Will we recover them? Sure. How much? 8 to 10 billion. Okay, in order to recoup. The second level of loss is let me stick with that for a minute, because Bart makes a good point that these things have informed a necessary national debate. Right? But they've done more than inform. They've also misshaped. Let's take the one program that I know we're going to dwell on, which is 215. All right? 215, and this was not Bart's work. Bart, I think, flagship piece on this was 702. But the 215, that's a metadata program. Okay, your phone bills, my phone bills. That was pushed out the door with an incredibly detailed coverage of the front end, which is they got all your phone records. And only over a period of several weeks did the back end story begin to get out there into the public domain. So what is it they do with them once they have them? And the people at NSA would make the argument that you may disagree even after you've gotten the back end story, but you really can't make an informed judgment until you have the whole context. Saw a recent poll that said over 30% of Americans, and I think this is because of the way this has been portrayed, over 30% of Americans think the 215 program allows NSA to listen to the content of your phone calls. All right? So, operational loss. Second loss is in relationships with foreign governments. And here, I am not talking about Angela Merkel being really upset. Okay? What I'm talking about is Angela Merkel's spy service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, or DGSE, or SISMI, or any other intelligence service around the world, to whom we would go for help in a matter of great sensitivity, a matter that would require great discretion, in which we would say, this is lawful, it's a little politically edgy, but it's the right thing to do for both our countries. Come on, let's you and us cooperate. We can keep a secret. There isn't another intelligence service in the world that should take that last sentence to the bank. And so our ability to cooperate has been eroded, not by the public outcry, okay, a little bit, but fundamentally been eroded by foreign intelligence services having no faith in our ability to keep things where they ought to be. And the third level of damage has to do with American industry, who has been very unfairly pilloried by this whole thing. And now you've got Google and Microsoft, and you got young Mr. Zuckerberg calling the president and complaining about how his company's being treated in the global digital domain. American companies do nothing more for the United States than other countries do for their sovereigns around the world. Microsoft, AT&T, etc., do the same thing that Deutsche Telekom does for German security services, etc., etc. But it's only American information that has been put out there. And it has been put out there in a way that suggests, almost declares, that only the Americans are doing this. I would suggest to you that practically the entire continent of Europe, including their elected representatives, now know more about American signals intelligence than they do about their own country's signals intelligence. And that's not a balanced discussion.
Well, I mean, there are lots of things that America might want to compete for global preeminence on, but I don't think one of them is going to be that we're the most closed government and we're the best at keeping secrets. And we don't need it because our security is, we are the global hegemon. We actually have a little bit of room. We have a little bit of running room, the luxury of allowing democratic debate over big questions like, should the NSA be collecting all of the records of all the calls that you and I make, or taking it out of the context of Section 215, this court-authorized telephone program. What do we think about bulk collection? What do we think about something that is new now, that the NSA never did in its history, on anything remotely like this scale, because the capabilities didn't exist, the communications flows themselves didn't exist. But the NSA now wants, and has taken many, many steps to achieve, a kind of a comprehensive situational awareness of the world. And it wants to be able to collect every electron and photon that passes over communications channels in case they might be needed. And it's not just metadata, although I actually think metadata is enormously important for privacy. But it's also what they do overseas. And frankly, the debate has been channeled somewhat deliberately in the current kind of political context towards the statutory kinds of surveillance. That is to say, under Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, that's the PRISM program that collects information from the 9 U.S. internet companies. Under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, also court supervised, they collect all your call records. Overseas, they are not bound by statute, supervised almost at all by the intelligence committees, or supervised by any court, including the intelligence court. They operate solely, in almost all cases, under the authority of a presidential executive order. And since we had a little bit of a historical sweep before about the 1970s, let me give you an additional point of view on that. The 1970s, after a bunch of very sort of gross abuses that today's programs don't at all resemble. They were sort of deliberate misuse of surveillance for domestic political purposes, for corrupt purposes. They created this structure of oversight in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and since then in the creation of the intelligence committees. So the idea was you can do as you like overseas, spy on the foreigners, but you can't do it at home. And the restriction was on spying on U.S. persons, citizens, and green card holders, and actually U.S. companies as well. And you can't do it from U.S. territory. So around the time that General Hayden became NSA director, the U.S. government started making the argument, and the executive started making the argument to Congress, you need to change this because the structure of global telecommunications has changed fundamentally. There's now lots of foreign traffic that passes through the United States. It's not American phone calls. It's not American emails. It's just the nature of the distributed network that you could be in Germany and calling Brazil, and the call passes in transit through the United States, for example. And so we need you to take more of the leash off. We need to have a lot more freedom to spy from U.S. territory. What they didn't say, and then Congress changed that law, what they didn't say and what Congress did not address is that lots of U.S. communications are now flowing across foreign choke points. And so if you're sitting here in Washington and you send an email to Cleveland, it is literally quite possible and likely that your email is going to cross Ireland or a Google data center in Hong Kong The global internet balances its load by distributing in microseconds the communications flows and the packet communications all over the place. And so when the NSA operates overseas, where it has very little constraint, and where it's allowed to presume that the people it's intercepting are foreign, it does things like this. The story I did with Ashkan Soltani, who's sitting here in the room, the NSA, with its British counterpart, the GCHQ, is breaking into the privately owned links that Google has between its many data centers around the world. So it's a data center in Hong Kong, data center in Ireland, data center in Latin America. They have private fiber that they've bought up. They have fiber that links them directly. NSA was breaking into that and intercepting the traffic that went through them, which is to say, ultimately, it's able to reassemble the entire contents of a data center if it wants to. Google and Yahoo won't say what proportion of their users are Americans, but let's say it's half. Let's say it's a third. You're talking about, ultimately, not only the metadata, but also the content of hundreds of millions of people that are crossing into these flows that the NSA feels free to dip into. And the legal term for that is incidental collection, right? So you're targeting foreigners of some kind or another. And as it happens, incidentally, foreseeably, but not your actual purpose, you're getting lots of Americans with it. And then once you have them in your storage tank, as the DNI Clapper has acknowledged in writing, or it was revealed this week that he's acknowledged in writing, the NSA feels free to search through it while in its own when it's in its own data repositories. So, if I say to you collectively in this room that I have a foreign target, I'm just going to collect everybody's smartphone, download everything from it, all your appointments, all your text messages, all your little confidences that you've exchanged with one another, with other people, your bank records, whatever happens to be on there that's going by. And I promise not to look at it, unless I have a really good reason. And if it turns out that 2/3 of you or 1/3 of you are Americans and you're in our tanks, that was incidental. It's perfectly legal. And you should be fine with it because it's not surveillance unless we're doing something with it. So don't try that argument if you want to download movies. Don't say, I have 3 terabytes of pirated movies and music on my hard drive, but I haven't listened to them yet, so it doesn't count. That's not our ordinary understanding either of the law or of what it means to be under surveillance. And those issues were never debated publicly because we didn't know about them. And what Snowden allowed us to do is say, is that okay with us?
They weren't. The last point, Bart, is one of his recent articles. Magic is a
Mystic.
Mystic, thank you. That describes that effort. And in Clapper's letter to Senator Wyden that revealed this, he pointed out that the committees actually debated whether or not they wanted to reauthorize the Mystic approach, and that they agreed that it had. So, we're not putting the cart on the bottom of the deck here. Bart's right. We all didn't call a town meeting and say, let me tell you how we do SIG in here and search for your approval. But it was known and consciously, specifically debated in committee whether or not that should continue. And by the way, that's an edgy way to do SIGINT. It gets close to what we used to call reverse targeting. All right? And so decent argument. But don't think, this was a renegade NSA, fully debated. Now, I'm going to try to be really efficient about this, all right? Because an awful lot of the Snowden revelations are putting things out there the way they are now. And I frankly think some of them are mischaracterized or inaccurately characterized. Despite the great talent of some of the folks who work on this is very complicated stuff, all right?
I'm curious that you've been a lot tougher than that. I wouldn't be over polite about it just because I'm sitting on the stage here.
Okay, he screwed this thing up so badly.
Thank you for that intervention.
It's beyond all recognition for anybody who really knows how this stuff works. Okay. So I think a lot of the story out there has been distorted, but let's just
But
let's
you
just
can't
assume.
entirely blame him, though, because he only knows what he's been given, right?
No,
That's actually not the case.
yeah, that's exactly right.
All right, then it's your fault.
I'm given a piece of paper. I don't assume that it's authentic. I don't assume that even if it's authentic that the facts contained therein are accurate. Turns out there are authentic documents in the world that are wrong. And
I used to get some of those briefings too.
yeah. And so I do a lot of reporting, and my colleagues do a lot of reporting around the material. And a lot of the reporting, certainly a big part of it, is to talk to the people who are the stakeholders in government who are running the programs or who are speaking for the people who are running the programs. And so Mystic, this is the story which the Washington Post wrote, a story by Ashkan and me, a couple of weeks ago now, I guess, which said that the United States is intercepting and recording all of the telephone calls of an entire foreign country and storing them for 30 days. And then of the billions of calls that go in this 30-day holding tank, millions get sent back to Fort Meade to be sort of stored and processed in their repositories.
It's got to be a little country, right?
We did not name the country, and we didn't give any hints about the country because we had already decided before we went to the U.S. government that we were not going to name the country. And I can't say exactly why. I'm in this bizarre position as a reporter of saying I can't. I've got to sort of hold things back from you. I mean, and I've always done that from time to time in stories over the years. I could give some examples of that, but here it happens all the time. But we were persuaded, even without yet talking to the U.S. government, that there were specific, concrete, obviously foreseeable harms that would come from naming the country, or or saying what kind of country it was, or what kinds of intelligence targets required this approach. But what we can say is this raises a big public policy question. If you live in that country, if you work in that country, or if you have relatives or friends in that country, and you make calls there, and that would in any country in the world amount to millions of Americans, then your calls are recorded. So now they're not just collecting metadata, they're collecting content. They're listening to your words, or that is to say they are recording your words, and they feel free to keep whichever ones they want and search whichever ones they want, because that was incidentally collected in the course of surveilling a foreign country, which is a legitimate foreign target. That's not something that NSA ever could imaginably have done before, very recent years. It is a capability that the NSA did without and kept us safe throughout the Cold War. And it is, as the General says, quite edgy and I think worthy of debate, even if Congress voted for something which had the effect of allowing that. There's one last point to be made here about oversight. Judge Walton, the chief judge of the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, said in his first ever interview with any news organization, told my colleague Carol Lenig that the court knows nothing unless the NSA or the U.S. government tells it. It doesn't have any independent fact-finding ability, that it can't go out and investigate. It doesn't have a technologist. It doesn't have a former NSA person on staff with expertise on these programs. And when the court in 2009 found that the NSA had been unlawfully running one of these big programs and had been consistently misrepresenting the facts of what it was doing to the court, the NSA's response through the Justice Department was, you could make fun of it as, these computers are so darn complicated, who understands what they're doing? But the argument actually was, there was no one at the NSA who fully understood the workings of the program, and therefore it was inadvertent that they were describing it incorrectly to the judge. So when you say that a judge is supervising it or Congress is overseeing it, the NSA is classifying almost all of this stuff, sometimes for very good reasons and sometimes, I think, plainly not, at the top secret code word level. There are fewer than 10% of members of Congress who have a staff member cleared to read anything at that level. Members of Congress do not go into a 10,000-page intelligence budget or sort of sit and study dense hearings and reports. They just don't. They rely on staff for that, just as General Hayden does when he runs an intelligence agency. But they don't. But most of them don't get to talk to a staff member who's cleared to read what they're talking about. And so the level of supervision is in some cases pretty theoretical.
So I want to pursue
No,
this.
wait. I'm falling way behind on my accusation countering count here, all right?
Okay.
So my turn for
Go
a few
ahead,
minutes.
and then
All So as I was saying, Bart does this half well half the time, all right? Even the best of folks are going to get some of this wrong because, as Bart just said, the NSA has time to time, it's so complicated, it's hard to explain. And not everyone is as conscientious as some other people reporting these stories. A lot of people take these stories and run them as quickly as they can to the darkest corner of the room, all right? But let's put that aside. Let's just say that we can reduce all of the stories that are out there to hardcore facts, all right? That we've pulled the hyperbole and the misrepresentation out, and we can get it down. So I'm not even going to argue about that's not what we're doing. Let's just assume we can all get it there, all right? You realize that you're coming in late in the third reel of a complex movie. And you're looking at the third reel. Again, assuming you've got good glasses, I'm assuming we've got all the chaff out of the way. Okay? You're looking at the third reel and making a decision, I know the butler did it. And you really can't make that decision until you walk back to the first reel. And where did these things come from? Why were they developed? So let me, it requires a lot more time, but I'll try to be very efficient about this, all right? I became director of NSA in 1999, and we were being overwhelmed by the volume of modern communications because we were approaching communications the way we had approached all of our previous life going after communications, which was burrow down, find a discrete comm path, get the right frequency, and listen to the very specifically targeted call. And now there we were with a tsunami of global data flying at us in a way that was beyond our ability to control. Look at you're all fairly young. You don't know what it's like communicating in '99, but trust me, a lot more photons and electrons out there now by exponents than there were then. We decided in 99, 2000, pre-9/11, all right, that the only way we could deal with volume was to quit acting like we're on the beach pushing a tsunami wave back and saying, well, we'll just try harder to keep the wave from engulfing us. And we decided, turn around and swim with the wave, dummy, and make the power of the wave your tool. That's bulk collection, and that's metadata. And that's why we did it. It was in response to a very specific challenge. If we had not in some way dealt with, we'd have gone deaf. Technology change number 2. NSA spent most of its life watching the Soviet Union. And there isn't anyone in this room, regardless of your political persuasion, is going to raise that much of a finger when civil liberties concerns, with NSA intercepting Soviet strategic rocket forces communications coming out of Moscow, going over microwave hops over the Ural Mountains, out to ICBM fields in Soviet Siberia, you know, while we're looking for interesting words to pop up on the net like launch, all right? The 21st century equivalent of that isolated signal on a dedicated network being run by an oligarchic superpower, the 21st century equivalent of that signal are proliferator, terrorist, money launderer, child trafficker, narco trafficker, etc. emails coexisting with your emails in a single unified global communication structure. There is no way NSA continues to do what it used to do for you if it can't go out there and be in the flow where your communications and mine are commingled with legitimately targeted communications. That's just a reality. A third change, okay, and Bart mentioned this already, okay, and that's the fact that the global communications grid changed in such a way that most global communications either resided or transited the United States just because of American dominance in global telecommunications. And yet, without the FISA Amendment Act, an email from a bad man in Pakistan to another bad man in Yemen, sitting on a server in Redmond, Washington, enjoyed the same Fourth Amendment protections you have. I don't think that was the intent of the founders, and that's why the change in the FISA Act. A fourth change in reality, and this is 9/11, all right? And that's simply the fact that the enemy was inside the gates, and that legitimate foreign intelligence targets, like those 19 people on the airplane, were here in America. After the 9/11 attack, there was a commission from the Hill called the Joint Inquiry Commission, the JIC. It was made up of both the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. And one of their findings was that NSA, that would be my NSA, the one I was running before 9/11, was entirely too cautious in dealing with the al-Qaeda communications of most importance to the United States. And that would be al-Qaeda communications, one end of which was in this country. And the metadata program was designed to be, frankly, the lightest possible touch we could devise to know which of those communications entering or leaving this land will be the ones we wanted to drill down on for content collection. Now, after having seen the whole movie now, you may still be pretty confident the butler did it. Right? You may still object to any or all of those four things I just suggested. Right? But they didn't develop out of an NSA director like me or Keith Alexander acting like Mr. Burns on The Simpsons going, "Excellent." I've been waiting to do this for decades. They were logical responses to technological and operational challenges. One more thought, and I'll yield the floor. Picture life as a triangle for this subject, okay? Right? And the three sides of the triangle, by the way, a happy triangle is an equilateral triangle. It's in harmony, all right? And the three sides are threat, technology, law, and policy. You got it? And what you want is that your technology is responsive to the threat and used within the confines of agreed law and policy. Those three things never changed at the same rate, but they are changing at amazingly different rates today. And the problem that Bart points out in his writing, and one that I will freely admit, is that as those other two sides change much faster than law and policy, that happy, contented, harmonic equilateral triangle turns into this violently looking isosceles thing, because these things have changed, whereas law and policy is still struggling to catch up. And that's kind of where we are in the debate.
Okay, I got a little bit lost with the triangles, but
I can do it again.
because Mike used to like to draw Venn diagrams like this, and so that, I'm used to the curves and not the lines. But I actually want to come back to the question that he made and hasn't the point he hasn't yet actually supported, which is the idea that we're getting it wrong a lot or we're getting out of context. That is certainly possible. It is certainly possible that there are things we don't know or that we're mischaracterizing something. I've actually been persuaded. There was one quite good story, I thought, that we were getting ready to publish, and I was persuaded that it was wrong because I'm talking to sources and I'm talking to the government. And I had very specific reasons. I received very specific reasons to believe that I had the context entirely wrong, and we just simply killed the story. But what we're actually doing is we are trying to shed light on the subject. We're trying to get it all the way right. And that is not the case when it comes to the public debate, on the part of the government. The government wants to keep the secrets. In a few outlying cases, people come out and say flatly false things to the public. Everyone knows about the example of Director Clapper and the question from Wyden about whether the NSA collects any kind of data at all about millions or tens of millions of Americans, and he said no. But much more often, there is just radically misleading information. There are comments made, there information provided that if a friend or family member did that to you, you would consider them to have betrayed you. You would consider them to have deliberately led you down the wrong path. Here's an example. This 215 program he's talking about, the collection of all the call records. And he does keep coming back to that and not the overseas collection, which
And I want to go through
in some ways is
all
much
of it
more
in a
intrusive.
second.
But for a long time, the government said, we won't tell you at all how many times we use this power that the Patriot Act gave us to collect business records. That's what they're called. It's the business records provision. In fact, it's top secret, which means it would do grave harm to the security of the United States if we told you the number of times we used it. And then Congress passed a law requiring them to disclose how many times they used it. And so they came out one year and they said, it turns out, there's nothing to worry about. I think this is 2009. And they said, We've only used it 24 times the last year. Really don't worry about it. And it turns out that you needed 4 of those times, say 4 quarterly applications of this power to get trillions of Americans, to get trillions of records, to trillions of call records, in principle, substantially all the call records. Because in practice, the way the program worked, it may be that it's a large, but not a fraction of that, but not the entirety of it. But they say 24. It turns out it's trillions of records, and they say we only take it when it's relevant to a terrorism investigation. It turns out that their meaning of the word relevant is all of them. Every one of them could possibly be relevant, so we're going to collect every one of them. If they had been straight with the American people, if they had said, we would like to be able to collect all the call records, and we will regulate our use of them as follows, and they had done that around the time they started actually collecting them, before Congress allowed it, soon after 9/11, or even if they'd done it in 2007, they might well have won public support for it. But the doing it behind our backs and the highly misleading statements about it have led to considerable degree of shock when people find out what they're doing.
So I'd like to go systematically through a few things that you've both referred to a few times, and just take maybe 3 or 5 minutes on each of the following 3 things. First, the FISA courts and how that works. Second, the 215 program, and then third, the 702. So starting with the FISA courts, it's my understanding that they were created in the 1970s, as it was referred to, coming out of a recommendation from the Church Committee, which uncovered all sorts of abuses in the American intelligence program before that, the spying on Martin Luther King and all of that. And to prevent that, they said, we're going to create this court, the special FISA court. So my question, General Hayden, is how exactly does the FISA court work? Can someone who is an intern or a relatively young person like Edward Snowden or one of the American university students who are interning at NSA or CIA, can they send an email to the FISA court and say, hey, I'd like some data on this person? Or what is the process to have a FISA request? How is the request made, and what process does it go through?
So lots of things to be said about it. The first thing to be said about it is the FISA court is incredibly odd. Okay? And let me tell you why it's odd. It exists. We are the only Western democracy that takes these questions to the third branch of government. Other countries, last time I checked, that were democratic, like the United Kingdom, issue these warrants within the ministries. It's the grand American experiment to involve the third branch of government in what is essentially, remember I told you historically, an exercise of executive prerogative in terms of conducting espionage. So what's unusual about it is that we do it this way. Now, in order to do it this way, we put certain restrictions on this court because it cannot nearly be as open as other courts in our system. It is, first of all, not adversarial. On the other hand, Tony Soprano doesn't get a lawyer either when the FBI wants to go up with a warrant on him. And unfortunately, and I really mean this, unfortunately, when we set up the FISA court, we use the language in law for which we use warrants in criminal proceedings in order to go up on wiretaps in FBI and other investigations. There is a sharp distinction, and it's not very often made in the public discourse about this. There is an incredibly sharp distinction between doing surveillance for law enforcement and doing surveillance for foreign intelligence purposes. I read very often commentary of suspicionless surveillance. That word has absolutely no meaning to me as a foreign intelligence officer. I don't collect information, particularly when we want to talk about foreign nationals, I don't collect information on foreign nationals because they're bad. I collect information on foreign nationals because they're interesting. I collect information on foreign nationals because their communications contain data that will keep Americans more free and more safe. They do not have to be bad people. Do not confuse the two. So now the court is designed to warrant collection against protected persons. All right, so we have reason to believe that A, B, or C is now the agent of a foreign power, even though they enjoy protection under the Fourth Amendment.
By protected persons, you mean Americans?
No, I mean all American citizens everywhere in the world and anyone in the United States of America.
Okay.
all right, including diplomats.
Okay.
All right, and any organizations comprised of A or B above.
Okay.
All right. In order to collect against them for foreign intelligence purposes, okay, requires a warrant. In addition, because of the peculiarities of the way the law was written, remember I told you it echoed the law enforcement statute. All right, it put specific restrictions on collecting on a wire in the United States that do not exist for collecting out of the air in the United States. And I'm not talking about grabbing your cell phones. What I'm talking about are satellite bounces into the United States.
And when
Right.
you want a warrant on a protected person, what do you have to give to the FISA court?
A FISA court gets a request for a warrant that looks like about the size of the phone book in the city the size of Cincinnati. It's about that thick. It's heavily laden with an awful lot of legal jargon. It is not all boilerplate. It requires a great deal of specifics. And in essence, what you're trying to prove to the judge is that the individual you want to target is the agent of a foreign power. I recall
No.
in one instance.
No, not anymore. That's what
That's what it
changed.
was, yeah. And
That's
that
what
changed in the
changed.
FISA Amendment of 2008.
But
Right.
that also changed with the Patriot Act,
Yeah.
which is a lot older.
And the Protect America Act, which kind of came between the two.
But you're describing. I mean, I'll let you finish. But you're describing an old model that is irrelevant to every single story that's been written about.
No,
this
that's not true.
Since this,
That's not true, Bart.
All right, well, go
In any
ahead.
event, in order to collect on a wire inside the United States, you also need the court's permission because of the peculiarities of the way the law was written.
And the big packet of information you were talking about, is that submitted by anybody at NSA or CIA or Department of Justice? Or does that have to go through a
It'll be
Department of Justice lawyer? Or how does that
It'll be
work?
crafted at the agency that wants the coverage. It'll go through a whole series of bureaucratic stops. It ends up at the Department of Justice. All the ones I'm aware of went through the White House for approval.
Okay. And so one of the things that we hear about the FISA courts is that they've approved almost every request that they've had, right? So is this gives the impression that it's just a rubber stamp,
Yeah.
sort of, irrelevant process. That's why I was pushing you for some of these details about how it goes through.
If the judge isn't happy with the FISA application, it's withdrawn. So it's not rejected, it's withdrawn. It's redone, all right? There is a dialogue there. No one who's worked the process would describe it as a rubber stamp.
Okay. So Bart, is this your understanding of the FISA process?
Well, almost everything that Mike's talking about it still happens and is accurately described with one exception, I think. But that's not the stuff that people are writing stories about. That's not the stuff that the public debate has been about. Okay, so that's the old model. The old model is, and they still use it for specific targets. We've got something, it may be just short of probable cause. It could be a reasonable articulable suspicion under the law. But we've got reasons to think that this person is not an, it used to be, they had to be an agent of a foreign power. Now it has to be relevant to an investigation of an agent of a foreign power. And they have to demonstrate the relevance. But this is an individual target. They want my records. They want your records with a name on them. And it's in ones and twos and threes. And there are a few thousand of those a year. The programs we're talking about now are...
So let's make that shift to the 215 program. We
Well,
want to explain
215 and 702. I mean, okay, there are four kinds. There are four kinds of data that George Bush ordered Mike Hayden to start collecting after 9/11 without the benefit of a statute and without the benefit of court supervision for several years, and until the Justice Department rebelled and 24 people were about to resign because they judged parts of the program to be illegal. This is the famous warrantless surveillance from the period of 2000, when it was first disclosed at the end of 2005. Okay. There is metadata, which is data about data. It's records of who talks to whom and when, or it might be where they are, or it might be what kind of equipment they're using, et cetera. That's metadata. Then there's content. They were collecting, broadly speaking, metadata and content for telephony and for internet communications. So the internet communications are not only emails, they're also your Skype chats. They're the documents you have stored in the cloud, their video, it's the entire universe of content that travels the internet, and then the telephony is your phone calls. And what happened after the Justice Department rebellion and after some public knowledge began to lead to debate is that the FISA court was asked to switch gears and did switch gears. No longer was it only issuing warrants for individuals, Joe and Tom and Jane and Mary. It was now asked to authorize, either on a quarterly or on an annual basis, huge programs of surveillance in which the court would now say once a year that you may collect anything that you like from Google and Yahoo and Microsoft, provided that you certify that it fits the following targeting rules and that you treat it and handle it according to the following minimization procedures, which are intended to protect the privacy of U.S. persons consistent with their operational needs. So there's some protection there. I don't deny that, but not all of it is as airtight as one might be led to believe. But in any case, the court is now essentially saying, here's a program under which you have standing authority to do this thing. Well, you don't have to tell me the names, the court. You don't tell the court the names of any of the people you're collecting on. You don't have to tell, there's not going to be an individual warrant for that person. And it used to be that in the intelligence world, it wasn't wrongdoing necessarily, but there had to be a specific showing that the individual was likely to be a valid foreign intelligence target. So that's gone now in these programs in the FISA court. The FISA court has accepted interpretations of the law that nobody in the public, and frankly, almost nobody in the community of people in the unclassified world who studied this stuff very closely, and I would count myself among them because several chapters of my last book were about these surveillance programs. I never suspected that the executive branch had told the court, and the court had agreed, that collecting every single person's call records was their definition of relevant to a terrorism investigation.
General,
Yeah,
why was that done?
So three or four things.
All the metadata.
Bart's description of what went on under the terrorist surveillance program when I was director of NSA is not quite accurate, and that's about all I can say about it. Bart's right about the court, about then the executive branch going to the court for warrants that were broad, generalized warrants rather than specific targeted warrants against individuals. What I was trying to describe earlier, right, was that the FISA Act put restrictions on who you could target and on kind of the techniques of targeting on a wire inside the United States. And most, if not all, of the generalized warrants that I think Bart is describing have to do with the reality that an awful lot of foreign communications are in the United States. And we approached the court then for approval to access those communications whose Americanness was created by their temporary geography, not by the communicants. Now, Bart's right. In any intelligence collection, there is incidental collection of protected persons, but NSA's got procedures in order to protect U.S. privacy. Your question was why the metadata?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as I said, Catelli gives us that first warrant in August of 2004.
This is then the chief judge of the FISA court.
Chief judge of the FISA court. In actuality, it allows us to resume things that were the subject of very heated discussions only the previous March. Right? And we did it by not relying solely on the president's power to conduct foreign intelligence, but by involving an additional branch of government, in this case, the judicial branch, in order to get a ruling as to whether or not what it was NSA was proposing met the reasonableness standard of the Fourth Amendment. You and I are not protected against all searches. You and I are protected against unreasonable searches. And it was felt that the best way to do this within the constitutional structure was to go to a court that is broadly familiar with surveillance and to ask that question of the judge. And in this case, the judge did indeed issue a warrant.
And basically, the collection of metadata, what it is right, collecting all of the phone call records, right? And the NSA would store in its warehouses all of these records,
Yeah.
which it would not access and would not read except for when it had permission from a FISA judge,
No.
right?
No.
Okay.
So let's take the 215 program, that's the one we're talking about. After Snowden's revelation, but before the president's speech. All right? So how it existed in that period, because it changes. All right? NSA, under FISA court warrant, gets the metadata from the phone companies, which are billing records. And the legal justification for that is those are records you've already shared with the phone company. These are third-party property. They belong to the phone company. They don't belong to you. So NSA gets these records. You're not identified. All that's in there is fact of call. This number called that number at this time for that long. And, you know, how many calls do 350 million people make a day? So you get an idea of how much data goes in there. Actually, what was happening was this program was set up by me when most of us were making phone calls through landlines. And it's much more difficult and more legally complex, and the fact that our cell phones don't have individual call billing, it was much more difficult as people then went to wireless communication to get the same kind of information in. So as time went by, the percentage of American phone calls that were showing up on a daily basis, phone records that were showing up on a daily basis in that database was shrinking down to about 25%. Okay? Now, the database is sealed off and can only be approached by about 24 people at NSA, all specially trained, and the machines they use to make queries of the database are keystroke monitored. What NSA does is take what it calls a seed number, almost always a foreign number, a number that shows up in a safe house in Yemen after it's been rolled up by Yemeni special forces. And we find pocket litter on an individual that shows he's affiliated with Al-Qaeda and he's got a cell phone. So what NSA can then do is go to that database and ask, does this phone number show up in here? And if, you know, some number in the Bronx raises its hands and says, well, yeah, I kind of talk to that number about once a week. NSA gets to ask that phone number in the Bronx, well, then who do you talk to? That's it. That's the metadata program. Now, the change that the president made in his speech is that NSA used to be able to do 3 hops, seed number to the Bronx, to who he called,
To the next one.
to the next one. The president made it 2 hops, seed number, bad guy, Bronx, 1 hop out. The president also said NSA has to go to the court every time it makes that query. Now, this is really unusual. Keep in mind what the court is judging. The court is judging whether or not NSA has a reasonable, articulable suspicion that that foreign number collected through foreign intelligence is actually affiliated with Al-Qaeda. It's not you the court's checking on. It's not your rights that it's double booking or anything. It's simply looking over the shoulder of the intelligence professional to see whether or not their intelligence judgment was correct. The last full year in which NSA has records, that yelling through the transom saying, anybody talk to this, happened 288 times.
Quickly, and then 7:02, and then we'll open up the questions from the floor.
It starts to get, people's eyes start to glaze over. You're talking now about nuances in law and operations, and this stuff is really complicated and difficult. Let's just take it down to fundamentals just a little bit. And again, I am truly not advocating a policy position. I don't know where the line should be drawn. I know that there are lines, I know that there are questions that belong in the public domain, that we collectively, boundaries we collectively ought to decide. That's my ideology as a reporter. That transparency enables the checking powers of civil society, of legal, of the courts, of lobbying, of voting, and all the other, and of market power. People get to decide, well, I don't want to do business with that company because it doesn't seem as safe as it used to seem to me, and companies then respond by competing on privacy. But let's take big picture. A wallet goes missing in this room. What's the most efficient way to search for it? Everybody gets searched on their way out the door. You know, you turn out your pockets, hold you upside down. Lots of societies do that. The British did that back in the 18th century, and that was generically the idea of a general warrant was a principal cause of the American Revolution. It was one of the main grievances. of the colonists. The NSA wants to be able to have that kind of efficiency because global communications flows are enormous and because it can. It's never been able to do that before until very recent years. Probably most of these programs couldn't have happened before the year 2000 or so. And the amount of data that exists in the world that has been produced and transmitted in the world since 2000 vastly eclipses all the data that was ever produced in the world in all of human history up until 2000. So there's a lot of it. And they want access to substantially all of it. And they're not just collecting metadata, as I said, in the programs that nobody ever wants to talk about. Overseas, they're collecting content, lots and lots of content. There's an access point called Muscular off the coast of Britain somewhere, at which the NSA and its British partner listen in on this sort of giant flows of data. One strand of the cable transmits 14 times the print content of the Library of Congress every second. I mean, it's huge data flows. They're sitting on that, and anything that looks like an address book, an email address book, an email inbox, or a chat buddy list, your instant messages, they say we want that, and they suck that in. That's considered content under law. That when you intercept all the phone calls in a country or all the transmissions between Google and Yahoo data centers, that's content, and that's being collected in bulk. So the question is, are we comfortable with that? And I understand why
people reading it? It's just being collected and sent to a server somewhere.
It's being but obviously humans can't lay eyes on all of that. Right. But they once they collect it, and there are certain to be billions of transactions in that data, or billions of communications that are incidentally Americans. They feel free to store as much of it as they can store and rationally believe that they can use. I mean, for example, address books. They don't want all address books. They only want they don't want ownerless address books. They only want address books of people that where the format in which it gets transmitted, they know whose address book it is. Other kinds of useless data they're always worried about throwing out. But in principle, they keep it and they feel free to search it once they have it.
And while you're just finishing your answer, I think we should open it up to questions now. We have about 40 minutes left. So we have two microphones. One here and one over there. We'll ask people to line up at the microphones, please. And finish your answer.
That's unusual. That's good. I'm glad we have an hour for this.
Okay. All right. So what I'll ask, Carrie?
All right, we're going first, me or him.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so I'll ask you to just identify yourself, and please ask a question, be brief. Speeches you can save for later in the dorm.
Okay. My name's Ari Basin. I'm a graduating senior here at our SIS. My question is for either or both of you. At what point do you want to start collecting on a terror subject inside the United States who is an American citizen?
I'll go first.
That's beyond my confidence. I'll
So
leave that
you
to Mike.
mean like the Tsarnaev kids?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you realize we didn't collect on the Tsarnaev kids.
I know that.
Right, that's right. So, and why didn't we? Because they're U.S. persons, and they had a First Amendment right to visit any websites they wanted to visit. And their web surfing was not monitored and would not be monitored. And there is not a program that allows us to monitor it.
No, but hang on. That's not actually why we didn't. That's not why the FBI and others did not monitor the Tsarnaev brothers. It's because when they got the tip from the Russian government that the Tsarnaev brothers, the older one, might be up to no good, they did a preliminary investigation. They looked into it, said we don't see anything here, and they stopped. If they had wanted to, the tip from the foreign government and any supporting information they might have picked up would have given them lots of authority to do the surveillance. It wasn't because they were protected persons; it's because they didn't think they were.
No, that's not. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. That wasn't the point I was trying to make. Given the tone of a lot of the coverage of the Snowden revelations, there is a presumption out there that NSA is just sucking everything up. And the fact of the matter is they are not. And in order to do, Bart's exactly right. In order to get that, we would already have had to have a certain level of suspicion and then go through the processes that allow them to be targeted. You know, so I get questions after Boston, my God, how come you guys didn't know they were going to those websites? Well, because we don't routinely look at that. These are First Amendment
But would you just
rights.
once answer the question about the overseas collection of Americans, which is much more intrusive?
Sure.
Okay, here's Google Data Center 1,
Yep.
here's Google Data Center 2 in two different countries. Here's the line between them.
Yep.
The NSA goes in and
Yep.
sits on that pipe and
Right.
takes in anything and everything it wants from that.
Right.
Even though hundreds of millions, billions of those communications will be U.S. communications
Okay.
incidentally collected. Why is that okay?
So let me make sure I understand the premise you're suggesting. You believe that Gmail should be a safe haven for legitimate foreign intelligence targets to the United States. So if you
Really?
use,
That's
if
how
you
you
use,
translate my
that's
question?
exactly how I translate your question. Because if I'm not on that wire, I'm not collecting Gmail users. Now Bart already said this begins to hurt your head. We just spent your whole evening here and we haven't gotten off at 2:15. But
We are now.
the approach you use in collecting signals intelligence looks like a bit like a funnel, all right? So you've got access here. And the next step is you collect. And then you process. Then you read or listen. You analyze. You draw up a report, and then you disseminate. Right? So you get the picture here, and the funnel gets smaller. And very often, people use the number out here that describes the potential access, and then impute that number way up the chain to those far more sophisticated and more narrowly focused activities here. That's not true. But I go back to my premise. Okay? Gmail is not a safe haven. Google is an international company. A lot of people you want to be targeted. Google is a U.S. person in certain circumstances. All right? By the way, that's actually not their cable. All right? It's a virtual cable that they use. Again, I ask you the question. Hotmail, Gmail, safe havens? These are global email providers. They're used by everyone. And is your theory that you can't touch it, Eric Schmidt's going to be really mad?
Okay, I want to let another question, but just in one line. There's pretty long distance to go between saying that Gmail should be a safe haven for terrorists and saying, on the other hand, that you should be, as the U.S. government, siphoning in all of the content that crosses that cable, including all the American communications. There's some room for gradation in between the two.
No, there is. And I just gave you that. I just gave you those steps in which you can conduct the gradation. Because not everything you potentially can access is collected. Not everything you collected is processed. Not everything you processed is reviewed. Not everything reviewed is reported. Not everything you report on is disseminated.
And just one last thing to kind of point out that exists here. The PRISM program, the first story I wrote about the NSA, gives the NSA more power than it ever had since the passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to get Gmail, to get all the Google content from the providers with under an annual authorization from the court. It had quite a bit of latitude. It was not allowed to go in and say, let's sift through everything on the server to see if there's anything in here that interests us. That's what it is doing in the overseas collection.
And Bart's right. There is a binary is too strong a word, but I'm going to go ahead and use it because there's a lot of truth to it. There is almost a Manichaean view of the world when it comes to American signals intelligence. All right? There's protected communications, and then there's everyone else. And NSA truly does have an awful lot more freedom of action going after foreign communications. It's the nature of the business. Now, that offends some of our European friends who do not attach privacy to a particular sovereign, but attach privacy to a softer, more generalized human right. I got it. That's a subject of discussion. Okay? But right now, the American approach to this is that it is really a binary world. Protected persons, persons who are not protected. And NSA's ability to work over here under 12333, the executive order that Bart suggested earlier, but not without congressional oversight, is really quite powerful.
Let's take a question over here.
This is just something I've heard about just reading newspapers about how various governments are trying to segregate their internets from the global internet. I know China's trying to do this, or I could be wrong, and Germany is thinking about doing this. What effect would this have on the NSA's ability to collect information, or is such a thing even possible? Is it possible to cut off the German internet from the American internet or the world internet?
Look, this is beyond my expertise, but I have a few thoughts on it. One is there are a lot more people and countries talking hyperbolically about their desire to sort of cut off the global internet and sort of keep all their data at home than are actually taking steps to do it or will plausibly do so, because you're cutting yourself off from the world. I mean, it's tremendously damaging, and it's not practical to. I mean, there are countries that say Google, Yahoo, from now on, all the data produced by Germans has to stay in German data storage. It can't go anywhere else in the world. It can't go into U.S. territory. The entire fundamental structure of the internet doesn't allow that. Yeah. Then there are countries like China or Iran that want to, or at the extreme end, North Korea, that want to cut themselves off, cut their citizens off from free debate, from free information, and are taking this and are using this NSA stuff essentially as an excuse to strengthen that argument. In some ways, if it were possible, it would be cleaner. It would take us back to World War II era, when you could break the German military code or the Japanese military code, and it was a no-brainer. If you could do it, nobody would see any downside to it at all. This is a code that is being used exclusively on networks used by the enemy in a war. Now, if you try to break encryption, almost everybody uses the same stuff. And by the way, when there's stuff in the files that shows that the NSA knows about this or that entity that's got its own homebrew, we're not writing about that. We're writing about things that have general public interest. So if you're breaking the encryption, the basic encryption standards that run the internet because you want to get the bad guys, you're also breaking everybody else's encryption. I mean, that's just the way fundamentally it works.
Okay, question here.
All right, thank you both so much for coming. My name is Evan Sweeney. I'm a freshman in the School of International Service. Like you, General Hayden, I'm a native of Pittsburgh. I have a question
We're
with
from
kind of...
Philadelphia. We gotta.
We used to think we needed a visa to go to Philadelphia.
I have one question with kind of two parts, one for Mr. Gellman and one for General Hayden. We've talked a lot about current times and past times, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the future. We live in a world of WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden's now, it seems, and I don't think that will be going away. So my question is, in the future, in the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, this increasing demand for transparency and this general sentiment, and also people like Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, the release of information, what kind of implications does this have for General Hayden, the future of organizations like the NSA and the CIA, and how they'll deal with those problems or how they might change as a result? And for Mr. Gellman, what kind of implications do these changes have among the sentiment of the American people and also the way the media responds and interacts with this kind of information? Thank you.
I'll go quick first and be very quick. Number one, we've got to recruit from that generation that produced both Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden. All right, and that's just a reality. And that generation has a different point, a different compass when it comes to transparency and secrecy than certainly my generation did. So that's reality, and that's something that my old community is going to have to deal with. Particularly since one of the major muscle movements in my old community since 9/11 has been the generalized sharing of information. I mean, we used to have a principle called need to know, and now the mantra for 10 or 11 years has been need to share. And now you've got Snowden, and now, I mean, this is really, really hard. One other impact of this is that when you decide to undertake an espionage activity, you put your, what can I gain over here, and what can I lose over here? All right? And let's just take the ones we've been talking about, which is signals intelligence. What can I gain? Well, I may be able to hear the head of state, and I hear the head of state's personal views. That's really cool. what could I lose? Oh, you could really be embarrassed if that ever was made public. Okay? So you make that, you make that judgment. By the way, this hand over here is not a moral hand. It's a political public relations hand, all right? This is what I would lose if it were made public, actually gets multiplied by the likelihood it's going to be made public. And the general factor of the likelihood of signals intelligence being made public, particularly when you're just grabbing a signal out of the air, that factor is kind of like 0. It's undetectable. And therefore, although the gain over here might have not been massive, the potential loss wasn't quite measurable because you couldn't figure out a way in which it would become public. With Snowden, that number over here is never going to be 0 again. You're going to have to factor in the insider threat that will make operations known that the target nation's counterintelligence services are never going to detect. And that actually might be the strongest governor break on aggressive signals intelligence collection against some countries, not American guilt or American friendship. It's just that calculus, that raw national interest calculus, now has a new factor over here.
I'll also try to be brief. In July, a month after the revelations started, Keith Alexander was then the director of the NSA, gave a talk, and he said that he wished he could bring every American into his huddle, tell him the plays he was calling, but the problem is that if he did that, then the bad guys would know too, and so it's too dangerous. And that is true. It's true that if he reveals his capabilities, then everyone can hear it. There's no more sort of encapsulated, walled-off communication in global affairs, but it's also true, and this gets to your question of how the American people react, that when we did find out what was happening inside his huddle, there were a lot of Americans who did not like the plays he was calling. And that is among the reasons why the existence of a classified stamp does not end the inquiry for me when I'm deciding whether something should be public. Sometimes there's all kinds of stuff that's classified that's just sort of self-evidently trivial. I have in my possession a Navy laundry manual for how you wash clothes aboard a ship that's stamped secret. I have also noticed that there's some very interesting variations in how classification works depending on the forums. So there's an internal NSA report I wrote about, and General Hayden did not like my story at all, in which I talked about the number of compliance incidents, as the NSA calls it, either errors or violations of rules and occasionally of law. There's statistics. How many times did we have this kind of compliance problem? How many times did we have that kind? The internal report classified that as secret, which by definition means that it would do harm to the national security of the United States if we knew the number of times they screwed up. That is relatively hard to defend. When they reported it to Congress, it was classified top secret, special intelligence, compartmented, and therefore, 91% of all congressional staffers couldn't read it, and it greatly restricted the oversight possibilities. So, I mean, the American public reacts when it's when not only there's something that the U.S. government is doing, it's something they didn't know they were doing, something that they might have accepted if they'd known in advance, or if it had been openly debated.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to return narrowly to the question of call chaining and ask General Hayden sort of if my understanding of multiplication is correct and of the program. That you mentioned there were only sort of 288, I think was the number.
Inquiries,
instances.
yeah.
Inquiries. But each of those, which was until recently 3 hops, if, over the course of a year, a phone calls, on the order of, 1,000 numbers as an order of magnitude. That's 1,000 is the first hop. The second hop would then be 1,000 times 1,000, 1,000,000. And the third hop, and obviously there's some overlap, so I'm over-extrapolating, but not by orders of magnitude. So I just wanted, if that understanding is correct, that when you're talking about 3 hops, you're not really talking about 288 things. You're talking about
The
many,
question was
many
asked
millions,
288
close to
times.
the totality of
No.
U.S. communications.
And I'm relying on statistics that Chris Inglis, who the former deputy director, put out there. And Chris's final statement, we got 24 people who can do this. We asked it 288 times. And in Chris's words now, and I've not been doing this for a long time, Chris's words, and those inquiries implicated 6,000 numbers. All right? Now, I agree with you. That's not the raw number of hops out. But this is an investigation. You're looking at this. By the way, it's just numbers. All right? No other identifying data is there. And what they're looking for are patterns that may so you got the spider chart coming out of this chain, and then you've got this other dirty number that hits a number in Buffalo. And it's really interesting when the second hop out of Buffalo hits a second hop out of Schenectady. All right? And that's why it's done. But it's done as an investigative process. And we're looking for linkages that might merit further investigation.
Yeah, Chris Inglis didn't explain what he meant by 6,000. It's actually almost there's a saying in newsrooms, danger reporter doing arithmetic, but it's hard to imagine how you can go even one hop with on the order of 300 numbers and touch only 6,000. That means that you're multiplying only by 200. So that means that each number called an average of less than one person per year. So here's what chaining is from a non-computer science person. We've all heard the 6 degrees of separation story, right? 6 degrees of separation on average. This is not just a play and a novel, but also some important computer science theoretical work that was done a few decades ago, which said that the mean number of hops you have to do to touch every single person in the world, or to touch from any one person to any other person, is 6. So let's suppose more conservatively that 300 people each call 100 people a year, and then you multiply that by 100 and by that by 100, and you get to 10 million. I think. Can check my work here, but that's a pretty large fraction of phone numbers in the United States.
Actually,
now, I'm not
just
saying
gets you to 1 million, but yeah.
Okay, 1 million.
That's why I don't do math.
That's why I said, I count on my fingers twice.
That's still a lot more than 6,000, though, right?
It is. That doesn't mean that they actually did chain three numbers from each of the numbers. They didn't. They also said it was fewer than 300 numbers in this 1 year. They also said the numbers have varied from year to year. You can be quite confident that the numbers have not varied downward. And those statements are perfectly consistent with the possibility that at some other year they had 5,000 seats. They would not have lied if they said it this way. But that is exactly the kind of massaging of data in their public statements that they've done in lots of other demonstrable
Let's go over here.
ways.
Let's take 2 questions.
Hi, my name's Harry. I actually hail from the land of GCHQ. My question is a little less technical, and is for either of you, both of you, or I guess neither of you. And it's simply pretty obvious for even the most casual observer that every time there's some kind of national tragedy in the U.S. or really any country, the 2 obvious examples of Pearl Harbor and 9/11, there was a reaction within government or within the populace for where we give up some liberty for security. So the Patriot Act, the internment of Japanese Americans are, again, the most obvious examples. And it takes some time, and then I guess sometimes society kind of scales this back. But is it concerning to both of you, or either of you, that given multiple 9/11s or events of that nature in a short span of time, that we could end up giving up a lot of liberty suddenly for a lot of security, whether or not you agree with the programs that we're engaging in?
Thank you. And right behind you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Harvard. That's still working. I'm a journalist I'm an aspiring journalist, and I go to school at School of International Service. My question has to do more so with investigative journalism. In light of Edward Snowden's leaks, we've seen journalists like Glenn Greenwald, New York Times' James Risen, as well as Fox's James Rosen, have been accused of co-conspirating with whistleblowers, as well as I guess congressional members are kind of pushing for them to be put into trial. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on investigative journalism, as well as do you think that investigative journalism and the press freedoms are under attack during the Obama administration and by the United States government?
Thank you.
Okay. I'll jump in on the 9/11 thing. Here's how I do my own personal moral calculus on this. And despite my professional role, we're all responsible for our actions as citizens and as human beings. One of my great fears is that we do not use the authorities available to us right now. And I use this little metaphor that if that's the box you want us to play in, all right, and we can legally play in. And, you know, Bart's articles raise these issues about national debate, but NSA will say, I got 2 houses of Congress, I got a president, I got a court, says it's good to go. And so until told otherwise, we're going to play 215 way out to the edges, all right? And we're going to take the hops, however many hops they take us. And the background ethical argument for that is that if we don't play fully within this box and we fail, and we have another catastrophic attack on the homeland, the box you will demand, not the one you will accept, but the box you will demand will be out here. So in one kind of reverse psychology sort of way, playing this aggressively within the law now is actually a protection against dangers to civil liberties in the future.
Do you share that, Bart, that concern that if any of these revelations make it easier for another terrorist attack on the U.S., that in the future it will perversely lead to demands for much greater surveillance?
All right, just as an aside, everybody wants to talk about terrorism. That does not account for nearly anything close to the majority of U.S. intelligence gathering. There are lots of different purposes. So, I mean, you know, it's a sort of an emotional trigger to talk about all this stuff as counterterrorism, and some of it is, some of it isn't. Look, our society's always had pendulum swings, right? It's a cliche. The difference is what happens under a regime of extreme secrecy. When you intern every Japanese citizen of the United States, they're in big internment camps, and everybody knows that you've announced it. And they're behind barbed wire, and you can take pictures of them, and you can go back and look at your books and history books, and there are the pictures. So we know when we've overreached, and we can come to a calmer decision after a certain period of time and say, you know what, I don't like that picture. That doesn't seem like that was the right thing to do. And then the Supreme Court reverses Korematsu against the United States. When you're doing everything in secret, then, or very large parts of your reaction to 9/11 in secret, then it's hard for us to decide whether we've gone too far. And so, you know, we are still now, all these years later, trying to resolve the torture debate. The Senate Intelligence Committee has now voted to recommend for declassification some hundreds of pages of the executive summary of its 6,000-page report. It cannot publish its report under current arrangements, under current understandings of the way these things work. I mean, there's no law that says that only the president gets to decide what's classified. Classification is an artifact of an executive order. Congress could pass a statute on it, it just hasn't done so. But in any case, we still don't know what happened very fully. I mean, there's 6,000 more pages of conversation about it that they want to have, and they're right now, as of this date, still precluded from publishing.
You have more information available about your country's espionage, freely available, than any other citizenry on the planet.
Okay, let's take 2 questions over here, and then we'll close that microphone.
My name is James Manning, and I'm graduating from the School of International Service this semester. And my question actually piggybacks off that pretty well. We've heard a lot about tonight about how there is an overclassification of data within the government, and how there is this sort of shock reaction about sources and methods. And my question then is then, how do we go about having that debate without compromising current intelligence, I guess, undertakings with the current sources and methods that are being used, while also sort of avoiding these shocks that Americans are so appalled with? Particularly, I'm interested in hearing General Hayden's answer.
Yeah.
And let's just take one more.
Sorry, yeah.
Actually, the 2 speakers just before me pretty much covered the questions I was going to ask, so if someone else can miss it.
You guys didn't really answer my question, though.
Oh, the one about the journalistic?
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
I'll be happy to answer that. I got distracted from it.
Sorry.
All right, look, on the journalistic one, there are some alarming signs. There have been more leaked probes and leaked prosecutions under Obama, as everybody's read, than in all previous presidents combined. They have used pretty aggressive means of surveillance against the Associated Press and against Fox News. their legal construct is that a leak of classified information is a counterintelligence problem. Counterintelligence is a legitimate foreign intelligence surveillance target, and therefore that makes reporters doing reporting legitimate targets of quite intrusive methods of electronic surveillance. So I spend a lot of my time, and it's a big tax on my time and my efficiency, trying to protect the security of my communications, not only from the U.S. government, which has been my threat model as an investigative reporter for a long time, but also from foreign governments who want to have documents that I have that I don't think should be public and who might want to try and come get them. All that being said, you know, I'm sitting up here on a stage, a free person, not in handcuffs, having a civil conversation with General Hayden, and there are you could read the Espionage Act or 18 U.S.C. 798 or various other statutes. There are ways to read them. There are available theories of prosecution under which I could be charged, and it's not because we don't have laws that could be used to prosecute journalists that we haven't prosecuted journalists. It's because we have a legal and political norm in this country that says that that's a line we don't want to cross without reasons very different from what we're seeing right now. So, by the way, when you ask about what sanctions or controls are on me, I'm certainly well aware that if I were to publish a story that clearly and obviously led to some gigantic security disaster, that could change the legal and political norm, according to which I am not charged with a crime.
I actually wrote an op-ed for CNN.com on the investigations, and I don't come out quite where Bart is, but I'm closer to him than you might think. I thought the prosecution of Thomas Drake up at NSA collapsed of its own weight because it had such overreach. Not that he didn't do some things that deserved some response from the government, but not that. And I was quite troubled myself by kind of the scattershot subpoena on the Associated Press, and then the identification of Rosen as a co-conspirator. So that's somebody with my background, all right? Transparency, and how do you make that work? It's really hard. I don't have a good answer. We are going to have to, the intelligence community, is going to have to be more transparent than it's ever been before.
Both the President and the Congress in the USA Freedom Act and several other bills have introduced a concept called the Special Advocate. This is a privacy and civil liberties advocate, which would be placed in the Foreign Information Surveillance Court, the FISC. And in some proposals of this official, you would be granted the power to appeal decisions of the FISC Court of Appeals to federal courts, potentially ending up in the Supreme Court. I was hoping to get your general thoughts and comments on this position in general, its potential effectiveness, and also whether you think the granting of standing was going too far.
Okay, and one more.
Hey guys, thanks for coming. My name is Alejandro Alvarez. I am a sophomore in the School of Communication, and my question, which is for both of you, is as follows. Former Vice President Dick Cheney spoke at our campus last week. During his speech, he stated that he believed that 9/11 could have been prevented if the NSA had the capabilities back then that it currently has today. Do you, both of you, agree with this statement, and why or why not?
There's been enormous amounts of scholarship on whether 9/11 could have been prevented with today's technology, but it's actually it's been fairly well established. It certainly was the view of the 9/11 Commission that 9/11 could have been prevented with what they had then had they used it as designed, had the coordination between FBI and CIA gone the way it should have, and so on. But that's sort of beyond my qualification to speak. The issue of the FISC advocate, also beyond my competence. I've followed a lot of the stories. I mean, I've read a lot of FISC opinions now, and I've read some FISA requests in the past. Any proceeding before a neutral arbiter is going to be in the long run work better and make better decisions if there's a checking power, if there's an advocate. We know that this FISA court you sort of had a number of big decisions for the first time in its history that said certain programs, very large-scale programs, were lawful when before it had always only considered individual warrants. We know that the first time that a federal judge considered that program in a contested legal proceeding. The judge found it to be unconstitutional. Another one considered it shortly after and said, no, we think it is constitutional. But that's the whole point of a contested proceeding tends to bring out the best arguments and the best evidence. So I mean, in principle, I'd be for that.
Yeah, very briefly, no advocate for individualized warrants. All right, we don't even do that in the criminal justice system. I'd entertain the arguments for an advocate in the generalized warrants in which an entire program then is blessed by the court because there are broad. Number one, it happens far less frequently, so it's just manageable, and number two, it has far-reaching implications, and so you might want the benefit of an adversary process there. With regard to 9/11, who asked that question? Yeah. What Vice President Cheney was referring to were the two guys in San Diego, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar. We at NSA intercepted about 7 or 8 of their phone calls from San Diego to a safe house in Yemen. Clearly the selector, the target, was a safe house in Yemen. And we detected the calls going in. There was nothing in the physics of the intercept, like how we were getting them, or in the content of the call that told us that these guys are making the call from San Diego. All right, so we just have people speaking Arabic calling into a known safe house in Yemen. I think one of them had a wife who was pregnant, and he was continually asking after her welfare. Intercepted 7 calls. I think we pushed out reports of significant intelligence on 2 or 3. But again, nothing in the physics of the intercept, in the content of the call. They're in San Diego. With the 215 program, when you yell through the transom with the phone number in Yemen, the phone number in San Diego raises its hand. And so that's what the Vice President was referring to. This would, and Bart's right. There are other ways we could have done better prior to 9/11, but saying that you could have done it otherwise, therefore you don't want to do this, is like saying all I want to do is win games close. No coach ever has that as a game plan. I'd like to have the additional capacity.
When you say that the number in San Diego then would have raised its hands under the 215 program, because that number was calling other places?
Because that metadata would have recorded the connection between that U.S. number and the Yemeni number.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got 2 last questions. One here and then here.
Hello, my name's Chris Ayers. I'm a sophomore in the School of Public Affairs. And my question is mainly for Mr. Gellman. You mentioned all the data that you get that you have to protect, make sure you're not only a target from the U.S. but outside countries. What do you do with the data that you consider to be too important to publish, but then also, and do you delete that data or do you keep that? And do you know what the other main receivers of this data have done?
Yeah, go ahead.
And for the final question, thank you very much, both of you, for getting very much into the details of this program. But to return more to the normative where we started out talking about, we've talked about how radically data collection has expanded in the last decade. And Mr. Gellman, you pointed us to this intercepts between Google centers and the bulk data collection. So since data collection has changed so much in the last 10 years, should our concept of surveillance and what it means to be surveilled as an American change? So when we're talking about data going from a private company to a private company, where we as Americans have willingly given up that data to a private company that is not under control of any sort as public citizens, should that still mean the same thing as when the government is surveilling us as individuals, or has surveillance and what it means to us changed?
All right. Security, for reasons that I think will be obvious, I'm not going to go into all the details. But as a general proposition, what I've done with the benefit of the expertise of some of the world's best people on this, because those have been available, is I've kept the material physically secure, say with physical barriers to where it is. It is on computers that are encrypted with the best modern encryption, which actually is now something that when you get to actually the frontal attack on encryption, The encryption still stands against any country in the world. And it never touches a network. It's on a computer that never has touched a network. It is. There are other things, but I'm not going to go any further than that. I have actually the ironic thing is I've been asking since the very first day in June of last year. I asked the government for a more secure way to communicate with the government when I tell them what I have each time I'm going to write a story. Say, I'd like to talk to you about this story. I'm going to tell you every single fact that I have that I'm contemplating publishing. I want to understand whether it's correct, whether it's in the right context, whether you have anything you want to tell me about the damage that might be done. I've said it's crazy to have this conversation over an open phone line or an email. And 9 months later, they have still not provided me with a secure means of having those conversations, which is as simple as a PGP key that, but it's not bureaucratically or legally simple at all for them. And so we have these odd conversations about, page 17 and a squiggly-looking shape on the bottom left and two words that rhyme with each other. And I mean, I'm literally two words that rhyme with each other on the page, so as to avoid putting it all out on an open phone line. So, there are ways that security could be improved.
Let me just add, let the record show, BART retains the data, just like NSA does.
All right.
And if you think that's the same, then we have more to talk about afterwards.
All right, and on the last question, really on the meaning of privacy in a digital age, right? In an age where every time anyone uses EasyPass or goes shopping or uses Google, we're giving all sorts of information to private companies, right? Voluntarily, right? So we're comfortable giving away tons of metadata and content of data, as everyone who's ever gotten a pop-up ad the next time after they've made an inquiry knows, right? So does this change how we think about these topics at all?
Yeah, of course it does. I mean, privacy is the line we continually negotiate between ourselves as unique creatures of God and as social animals. And that line changes. And I think it's rapidly changing now with the digital interconnected age. That is a nightmare for security services in a democracy who are sworn to protect reasonable expectations of privacy when the definition of reasonable is a movable feast within the broader culture.
There are two things going on here, sort of legally and conceptually. In terms of privacy, one is the third-party doctrine, which you've mentioned, which is to say, I voluntarily told Verizon who I was calling, and I voluntarily transmitted my voice over communications which cross all sorts of other companies. Therefore, I have no lawful or moral reason to believe that it's confidential. See, privacy is relational and situational. I may be happy to tell you something, but not all these other guys, and certainly not the government, or certainly not some company that wants to sell me to an ad network. It's just not the way it works. I mean, the third-party doctrine began as an analog pencil and paper thing, where you robbed a bank, and then you made a deposit at another bank, and you voluntarily told this other bank you had this $300,000. And therefore you waived your right to privacy on that. Now, you could have kept it under your bed, right? I mean, now the equivalent is I'm going to cut myself off entirely from civilization, because there's no way for us to function in this city or in this society, or be employed or be students without using these communication methods. So the idea that if we allow Google to know that we're sending a love letter to our love interest, that we're happy to have anybody in the world read it, that's just preposterous. And the other part of it is reasonable expectation of privacy, and it's been interpreted by the U.S. government to mean that once you know that the means exist to be intercepted or overheard, this is one element of it, then you have no reasonable expectation that it won't be happening to you. So if I tell you that we have through-the-wall thermal imaging then you understand that your sex life in your bedroom is not immune from vans driving around and taking pictures of you through the walls. And that technology actually does exist. So you're all warned now. I mean, so both of these concepts have been stretched sort of beyond all plausible shape in terms of our intuitions. And there's a lot of work being done right now to try to bring that back into reason.
Well, thank you both very much for an illuminating and provocative conversation. And we'll continue to surveil your further thoughts on this as they develop. So thank you very much.